In 2014, in County Meath, Ireland, the Dunsany estate, 800 years old, was suffering from decades of intensive farming. Pesticides, herbicides, and years of heavy agricultural use had nearly wiped out the local ecosystem. That's when the owner made a decision that looked insane. He stopped beef, lamb, and game production on 750 acres and simply did nothing. The first years looked like a disaster. Fields filled up with thistle and ragwort. Neighbors called him a waster. But 10 years later, Birdwatch Ireland recorded the county's first ever great spotted woodpecker nest. Rare birds returned, along with predators that had vanished and dozens of plant species not seen there in years. How did doing nothing accomplish what decades of government programs could not? Ireland markets itself as a country of green hills. In reality, 70% of the island is farmland, and 90% of that is pasture for livestock. With 5 million people, there are 7 million cattle. What was once forest, 80% of the island 6,000 years ago, had shrunk to 1% cover by 1925, the lowest in Europe. The great spotted woodpecker was one of the last species to disappear. It needs old, decaying trees, which 17th and 18th century logging left none of. Government afforestation programs do not fix this. A grant pays for rows of Sitka spruce, a species not even native to the island. On paper, it counts as forest cover, but on the ground, it is a Christmas tree farm with no understory, no insects, no woodpeckers. This was the land Baron Plunkett inherited in 2011. Born in New York, he had been making short films in London. He wanted to direct horror movies, not run a castle built in 1180. But when his father, the 20th Baron, died, the inheritance did not ask whether he wanted it. The title and 1,600 acres passed to him immediately. Before he died, his father had told him about the animals that lived on these fields during his own childhood: otter, barn owl, snipe, corncrake, peregrine falcon, red kite. By that point, none of those species remained on the land. The list sounded like an inventory of losses, and turned out to be an almost exact map of what would return to that same land in under a decade. In 2014, he became vegan and realized that continuing to keep livestock did not square with his own beliefs. He made a phone call the family accountant still remembers. He said, "As of today, we're not doing this anymore." The accountant asked, "Okay, what will you do instead?" He replied, "We're not going to do anything. I'm leaving the land alone." 750 of the 1,600 acres, half the inheritance, he took out of production with a single decision. What happened next rests on one principle of ecological succession. Grasses and weeds capture the light first, and in their shade grows thorny scrub, blackthorn, hawthorn, wild rose, which shields young saplings from grazing animals until they grow tall enough. Then the scrub, starved of light beneath the new canopy, dies back on its own. In this chain, Plunkett is the one who put down the scythe. In 2014, the decision became literal. Plunkett removed the livestock, stopped the mowing, banned logging, halted everything the land had done for the past 800 years. He planted nothing and sowed nothing. He simply stopped intervening and waited. The first year looked like a failure. The first year was a disaster, Plunkett says. The second year was worse. A field that had been a flat, tidy pasture turned into a chaotic mess of dry grass and bare patches, exactly the look neighbors used as proof of his madness. The third year was somehow worse than the second. The weeds, in his words, were on steroids, forming solid stands of thistle and nettle that choked out everything but themselves. Only in the fourth year did something start to shift, slowly, with no single moment he could point to over the fence as proof he'd been right. The backlash came fast, and not just in words. "They just thought I was a fool," he told The Guardian. "A wastrel, an idiot." One farmer told him he should be ashamed of ruining good land his family had farmed for their own benefit for 6 centuries, which he was now deliberately leaving untended. The sharpest reaction came from hunters who had walked these woods for free for decades, shooting deer, snipe, pheasant without asking anyone's permission. Now those woods were closed to them by the decision of a man who'd just inherited a title. Plunkett began patrolling the land himself at dawn, filming trespassers and calling the police. "I decided to go to war," he said. I got threats of being beaten up, online threats. My tires were slashed. The livestock were gone. Logging was banned. Two main sources of income disappeared at once, with no compensation or grant to cover the gap. What remained, leased arable land and the film production Plunkett was developing in parallel at the castle, became the only financial backbone holding the whole project up. The patrols paid off faster than the forest regeneration itself did. Illegal hunting dropped so sharply that the reserve, in Plunkett's own words, became a safe haven for species still declining everywhere else in the country. What started as an act of personal, stubborn resistance turned out to be the precondition without which the rest of the story simply would not have happened. No woodpecker nests where rifles walk through every spring. 3 years had passed since the last animal was moved off the farm and out of the reserve. Late spring, grass higher than shoulder height. Plunkett was walking across a field where cattle once grazed and came to the edge of a young wood, where trees planted by his own grandfather now stood like a wall. A few meters away, a pair of eyes appeared in the grass, then 3 more. A young, antlerless buck and 3 does. They just stood there, watching. He would later write about this moment in a memoir published in 2025. Before that day, he'd felt like a ghost wandering the halls of former great men, a permanent imposter among a family of decorated writers and reformers. The deer that did not run became, for him, the first proof that the weight of his lineage could be carried differently, not as a sentence, but as a task he'd chosen to take on himself. The castle has stood on the River Skane since 1180, when Hugh de Lacy built it there specifically to control the crossing. 9 centuries later, that same river would become the site of the next discovery. It was along this river, in the woodland stretching along its banks, that in December 2020, Niall Hatch of Birdwatch Ireland came out to confirm a field sighting local birdwatchers had already been talking about for weeks. He found a pair of great spotted woodpeckers and confirmed nesting. "There's no evidence they were ever in Meath before," Hatch told the Irish Times. This didn't mean the species had been absent from Ireland for 3 centuries, as the story is sometimes retold. The woodpecker had started returning to the island back in 2008 in Wicklow and had been slowly expanding its range westward ever since. Dunsany was the first confirmed sighting in County Meath specifically, a point on the spread map that had previously been blank. That same year, botanists from Trinity College, who had begun visiting the site more and more often, counted 50 butterflies spaced 200 meters apart on a single walk. An otter simply turned up one day on that same river. "The otters are back," Plunkett told the European Rewilding Network. "It is the first time in my life I have seen this species on the reserve." There had been no previous sightings by the family across 9 centuries living on this land. It was simply the fact that an animal that had never been there in his memory had decided to stay. The camera traps Plunkett started setting up in the woods gradually picked up things he had not expected to see. Hedgehogs, stoats, and eventually a pine marten, one of the island's rarest fur-bearing species. The marten preys on the gray squirrel, a North American import that had spent a century pushing the native red squirrel out of Irish woodlands. Where the marten shows up, the red squirrel comes back on its own. The predator simply removed the competitor. "It took me a few years to figure out who half of these creatures even were," Plunkett said of the steady stream of new species appearing each year. "I was seeing birds I did not even know existed. Suddenly, I was finding beetles never before documented in Ireland." Observation became a daily habit for him rather than an occasional interest. By his own account, he never leaves the house without 2 cameras, keeping a visual diary of what shows up on the land. Some of what he saw, he decided to actively support. He converted an old tennis court deep in the estate into an artificial otter shelter, a soft release site for animals recovering from injury. Working with volunteers from Ireland's only wildlife hospital, he began releasing rehabilitated hedgehogs, fox cubs, and birds of prey onto the reserve, not as exhibits, but as a population he was deliberately supplementing until the land itself could sustain enough of them on its own. The war Plunkett declared in 2014 did not end with the last poacher caught. It just moved from the woods into government offices. The Irish government is considering a plan to restore an old rail line that once ran through here before it closed. The new route runs directly through the estate, directly through that same stretch of woodland along the skein where woodpeckers now nest, woodpeckers that were not there at all 10 years ago, where an otter was seen for the first time in Plunkett's life. If the project is approved, a strip of mature forest will be cut down. Nature spent more than 10 years patiently growing it, with no grant and no plan behind it. And by the same math used to calculate the age of an Irish oak, no one currently sitting in an office making this decision will live to see it regrown. Plunkett does not hide how serious he is about stopping this. In one interview, he said he was prepared to go to Mountjoy, Dublin's most notorious prison, to show just how far he is willing to go to stop the state from destroying something that had only just begun to come back. The Baron, who fought poachers on his own land in 2014, is now preparing to fight his own government over that same land. And this time, the stakes are not private threats, but an official decision that could undo 11 years of work with a single signature. Before the rewilding, the meadow cover supported 3 species of grass. Now it's 23. Plunkett says, "I didn't do this. The birds did." The changes were not only visible above ground. Without cattle hooves compacting the soil for decades, and with the return of earthworms and other underground life, the soil beneath the meadows became porous in a different way. Tall grass, which reaches 2 meters in summer, collapses on itself in layers come autumn. Plunkett compares it to lettuce left too long in the fridge. When the rains come, water does not hit the bare ground in a single rush, but seeps between the layers of decaying grass, spreading out more slowly and evenly. By his own observation, the reserve handles floods and heat better than neighboring fields, a result of soil that has been given time to start breathing again. He and his team planted 2,500 trees by hand in a single year on top of what the forest was regenerating on its own. Not as a replacement for the natural process, but as insurance for patches where the seed bank turned out too poor to restart the cycle by itself. A neighboring farmer whose field borders the reserve noticed a sudden improvement in his harvest and initially credited his own skills. After learning about the project next door, he started thinking it was not about him at all, but about the insects and pollinators the rewilding had begun sending over the fence. More living creatures overall means more pollination, regardless of how much agronomy goes into the neighboring field. Birds of prey have increased in number by roughly 40% over this period, and according to Plunkett, they did the most to push out the invasive gray squirrel from the property, even before the pine marten took over that job. One predator pressed the competitor from above, another from below. The native red squirrel got breathing room from both directions at once. The Irish Bee Conservation Project placed 8 hives on the property. Not for honey, but to preserve the native black bee, a species being crowded out by hybrid breeds everywhere else in the country. The colonies feed on wildflowers, which only became abundant in the meadows once the livestock disappeared. The bees do not stay within the fence line. They pollinate the arable fields on both sides of the reserve border too, the same effect that first puzzled the neighbor with the better harvest. In 2020, Dunsany became Ireland's first member of the European Rewilding Network, a group of 61 members across 27 countries. Plunkett's method differs even from the best-known European benchmark, the GNEP estate in the United Kingdom. There, free-ranging herbivores stand in as a substitute for extinct wild herds, and some of the animals are eventually slaughtered for meat. Plunkett rejected that model entirely. He calls his version rewilding, vegan rewilding, no replacement herd, no slaughter, not a single animal kept for any product. What's happening behind Dunsany's gates is about as close as it gets to a pure subtraction experiment on lowland Irish ecology. Remove the pressure and see what the land does on its own. Not everyone in the Irish conservation community agrees that the passive approach is the best one. The state body TGASC has historically backed active afforestation, rows of saplings that produce a measurable forest cover number faster, even if it is a conifer monoculture rather than a wild forest. Plunkett himself admits the limits of his own model. The project rests on three things simultaneously: the inherited castle, income from film production, and leased farmland that covers the losses from giving up livestock. Remove any one of those supports, and by his own admission, the experiment would not have lasted 3 years. The question of inheritance also remains open. Plunkett's daughter, Constance, will inherit the land. The title, under current rules, will pass elsewhere. No Irish law protects rewilded status. The livestock could come back. The hunting leases could come back. The mowers could come back. It all rests on one person who decided to keep the gates shut, and on whoever decides to keep them that way after him. The forest that started growing in 2014 at the growth rate of a native Irish oak will not reach maturity for roughly another century. Such an oak can live 500 to 1,000 years. Everything visitors to Dunsany see today is the first page of a book that neither Plunkett nor his daughter nor even his grandchildren will live to finish. Dunsany proves that 800 years of ecological memory can be woken up by a single decision. It does not prove that decision will outlast the one specific person sitting at the desk where it was made. Dunsany today is only the first chapter. I will be long dead in 200 years, he says, but the trees I am planting will, I hope, bring joy to future generations if we embrace biodiversity now. That means the project that began as one man's decision now depends on decisions made by people who do not even exist yet. Plunkett's daughter will inherit the land. Whether she keeps the gates closed is a question with no answer yet, and will not have one for decades. Neighbors who once clashed with Plunkett over the closed gates now bring him owl boxes themselves, and as soon as these go up in the trees, barn owls move in almost without delay. The hostility the project began with in 2014 has, over 11 years, flipped into its opposite. The same people who lost access to hunting now help repopulate the land with the species they once hunted. Meanwhile, the land keeps adding one new species a year, as it has for 11 years running. Dunsany now runs seasonal tours, May, part of August, the first 2 weeks of September, €25 per adult. No infrastructure for tour buses, Plunkett deliberately keeps it far from a theme park model. The first visitors were locals with a scientific interest. Now people come from all over the world to see what grew up around him in the time nobody planted anything.